Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin. We are here again in the midst of World War III for another episode, 59, I believe it is, getting close to 60 episodes. So thank you so much for sticking around with us after all these weeks. Things are really getting crazy, still hot in the Middle East. Of course, right now we're going to be discussing some crazy things going on in my home state, here in the great state of Texas, where a constitutional crisis seems to be unfolding as our porous open border. It was just reported in December, Border Patrol had 302,000 encounters with illegal immigrants. So at least 300,000 plus illegal immigrants poured into Texas December 2023, highest on record. So we're going to be discussing the standoff in Eagle Pass. We're going to be talking about the situation in Russia with that huge Ukrainian POW plane shot down and the general situation expanding there as we move closer and closer to total Ukrainian state collapse. Of course, we're going to be talking about the situation in Europe as generals from the Netherlands to Scandinavia to other parts of Europe are talking about war with Russia. And of course, we're going to be talking about some church stuff with Elpidophoros on Athos and a whole bunch of other things going on all across the world as World War III continues to rage on. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and I think it's important to address this particular Texas-U.S. question because as much as it appears as a simple domestic situation in America, it of course, ultimately, now that it has evolved into a constitutional crisis, or like, I guess, the onset of a constitutional crisis, it will affect the entire world in and of itself because the U.S., again, it is the nexus for most economic relations around the world. It is the richest, the most prosperous economy at the moment. It is sort of the center of all the ties and all the, the ropes which connect to, shall we say, world banking as well as exports and imports. Right at the moment, this particular role has not transitioned to China just yet. So naturally, it's very important as to what exactly occurs in one of the largest states in the U.S. But looking at the Texas situation, I think in terms of numbers, the actual Border Patrol has done some amazing things just in the last week. Apprehensions statistically have been reduced. So apprehensions have reduced, and this only means that the migrants are a lot more hesitant to actually cross the border. So they're hanging out in northern Mexico for a bit longer. The apprehensions have decreased from December's 8,000 per day. And look, these numbers are insane, right? Considering, we've looked at numbers of people moving, numbers of people, say, dying, being injured in Israel, Ukraine. So we can kind of tell when numbers are this size, but 8,000 people crossing a border per day in December of 2023 is absolutely incredible. And that number has fallen to roughly 3,000 to 4,000 per day at the moment because of the work that the National Guard has been doing and the other law enforcement agencies from the state of Texas. Of course, Governor Abbott seems to have really involved himself really deeply. And we don't know if Governor Abbott is doing this out of his sort of national patriotic aspirations, or it's simply that the interest of his particular elite group in Texas is currently undermined by the situation because, again, his state will be the recipient of all the negative implications of these large swaths of immigrants coming over the border. This includes, of course, child smuggling, narcotics. The Texas communities will be affected by all these things. And, of course, we're talking about crime as well. Lest we forget the particular people, facilitating these transportations of migrants, both, illegal as well as so-called refugees, right, crossing the border. It mostly is very tied closely to the cartels, those notorious criminal organizations operating in a mafia-like state, almost like these criminal organizations operating in Mexico and definitely crossing the border with Texas on occasion in order to push crime in that particular American state. So it's looking like Governor Abbott, really, the ball is in his court at the moment, how far he wants to take this issue, and it looks like he's not conceding. So whether or not he himself is that much of a red-pilled sort of Trump-like patriot and he wants to defend the country, or it's simply he's protecting his own interests as the governor and looking out for his own political career, I'm not sure. But in either capacity, his interests now directly align with those of the people of Texas, and it looks like Texas is essentially fighting not just for its own future, but also for the future of the entire United States at this point.
Yeah, we'll take you through the whole timeline here. I want to start with Abbott's official statement when he effectively announced he was defying the federal government and the Supreme Court's ruling that the feds could cut the razor wire that was set up across the Rio Grande River in Shelby Park in Eagle Pass, Texas, down at the border. And he said, this was on January 24th, 2024, he said, "The federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. The executive branch of the United States has a constitutional duty to enforce federal laws protecting states, including immigration laws on the books right now. President Biden has refused to enforce those laws and has even violated them. The result is that he has smashed records for illegal immigration. Despite having been put on notice in a series of letters, one of which I delivered to him by hand, President Biden has ignored Texas's demand that he perform his constitutional duties. He then outlines some of the numbers and horrible facts about the border crisis that Biden has facilitated. He then goes on to say, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. That is why the framers included both Article 4, Section 4, which promises that the federal government shall protect each state against invasion, and Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. The failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4, Section 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I have already declared an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to invoke Texas's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself. That authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. And since then, 25 other states, so a total coalition of 26 states, have, kind of thrown their hat in behind this and say they support Governor Abbott and support Texas. It's every single state with a Republican governor, with the exception of Vermont. And then, of course, North Carolina, who has a Democrat governor, their lieutenant governor echoed support for Texas. Kentucky's attorney general, who's Republican, echoed support, and a few other states as well had their Republican lower statewide officials express support. And we've seen the Texas National Guard, the Texas Military Department, which again answers directly to the governor. They have been mobilized, and I believe 10 other states also have their National Guards on the border. I know Oklahoma, South Carolina, I believe Wyoming, a few others have their National Guards down there. Florida obviously has sent, I believe also there's highway patrol on the roads and stuff as well. So it's a large coalition, and it does seem that much more recently, at least, Biden has effectively, I don't want to say backed down, but he has sent a letter to the Senate saying that he will sign bipartisan immigration reform and border security if it is sent to his desk. So I assume that means that he will, that means the ball is in the Democrats and the Senate's court at that point, if Biden will sign whatever comes to his desk on this. But of course, they have sent letters to Attorney General Ken Paxton, who was great. He survived an impeachment attempt by liberal Republicans a few months back, which I supported him against. People had to vote. People voted for him again. There was a recall, and he won re-election. And he was sent a letter from DHS to say that they need to allow Border Patrol and DHS into Shelby Park at Eagle Pass, and he said they're not going to do that. Of course, this is all helped by the fact that Border Patrol and these people down there don't actually want to cut the razor wires. So there's always the question that, say, the government, which it doesn't seem like they're going to do, but that the feds go crazy and wanted to have an actual confrontation, with Texas or whichever, that I can't imagine that these people that are already working on the border and see how open and crazy it is really have any interest in fighting Texas for wanting to do the basic sane thing of stopping just one of the most porous areas of this ridiculously open border. And again, people are talking about civil war, and again, it does really paint an interesting picture. And a lot of people have said this similar point, but no, this isn't actually going to lead to a civil war. What it does show is that in the future, when, because of the open border, the demographics in America are so cooked and are so irreparable that states are going to be the only mechanisms with which Republicans can, leverage power. And right now people see that despite the fact that Republicans are becoming less and less viable on the national level, like some say Trump is really going to be the last one that can even rally a national coalition as a Republican, we still have the majority of these statewide elected offices in these states, due to this federal system. And the Senate as well, of course, will help, because that's why they call these systems racist, because all these flyover states full of white people have huge representation with their 2 senators that they send to the Senate, and these governors that are quite powerful. And that's why that's the whole U.S. system being racist kind of thing. But the founders did think about this, and now we've kind of going to have to abandon the federal jurisdiction, and we're going to have to focus on rallying coalitions of states to do the right thing. And again, the energy isn't there for that right now. Greg Abbott, I don't think, is brave enough. Again, as we speak, Greg Abbott is actually in India right now, at rallies trying to get more Indians to come and do, tech labor and whatnot in the state of Texas, and, just probably rallying for general Indian support because we have so many dang Indians here because Abbott doesn't care about bringing in legal immigrants. Because that's the whole thing. All these people are saber rattling about the border and illegal immigration, but they all just, it would be all okay if all these people just had a piece of paper saying they were doing it legally, which is just absurd, of course, because the important factor here is that the white man is being replaced in his own country by people that tend to vote for silly libtarded nonsense because of low IQ and identity politics nonsense and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it is too late in many ways on that demographic front, and people crap on Abbott for shipping these illegal immigrants to these other places. But from a Texas nationalist perspective, people are talking about Texit. I was at the Texas Nationalist Conference, the Texit Conference, last year. But, people are talking about, from a Texas national perspective, that it does help Texas to get some of these illegal immigrants out of the state, even if, it does hurt the country as a whole to facilitate their spread across, vast swaths of the nation with bus tickets and whatnot. But look, at a certain level, it would just get so crazy in Texas if they all just stayed here because this is the main place where they come through. Arizona, New Mexico, California have a lot as well, but Texas is the one state with the single longest border of those four states that border Mexico. So it's a really tough situation. Of course, I am somewhat grateful that these Republicans and Abbott did something. Ken Paxton is the better figure than Abbott. He's more based, even though they're both, they're still Republicans, so how based can it really get? But this does show you the true ridiculousness that we got to where it took to the point where record-setting illegal immigration, the feds want to literally just cut, like, any barbed wire that's up there, and finally the states were like, all right, no, that's a bit ridiculous. And, now here we are.
Speaking of cooking, I think that the one person who's like not left the kitchen, I think yet, is Donald J. Trump, who has, of course, called
Mm.
openly on his social media that all willing states should send National Guard soldiers to Texas. So he's completely taking advantage of the situation, naturally calling upon using his enormous platform amongst all Republicans, and he is sort of like the independent Republican leader, of course, and his soon to be victory in the presidential race will probably cement that. But naturally, he's pushing all that he has in order to position himself in the best possible way against this corrupt Biden administration, and that means supporting, of course, the border, which naturally was one of the main political talking points of his presidential race and ensuing presidency, which was blocked by the courts. Again, the issue returns back to these corrupt courts, not just the federal circuit courts, right, operating in Texas and all these southern states and all counties, but essentially we're talking about the constitutional courts, which we've heard some commentary and we've read commentary from various constitutional lawyers and even conservative ones. Like this is one, Jonathan Turley. He essentially says that even though he agrees with Governor Greg Abbott, he believes Governor Greg Abbott will have, and the state of Texas will find it very difficult to argue constitutionally that the state of Texas is in a state of imminent danger from these waves of illegal immigrants and can actually purport to utilize its states' rights, its sort of responsibility for self-defense, because again, imminent danger needs to be proven, invasion needs to be proven in a court of law, and these constitutional lawyers, they're all saying that, look, we love conservatism, we love Texas, but can the state itself, if it's taken to a constitutional court, even before the Supreme Court, for example, like a major court of appeals, can it actually prove this particular state of affairs on its border? And again, this resorts to the larger philosophical question of, as much as we love the American Constitution, and it is a fairly well-written document, it has withstood at least 200 years, and yeah, it definitely has been amended a couple of times, but it still is giving American people a lot more rights than some other places around the world. But again, the query arises, constitutions, what really are they, these documents, if we cannot interpret them properly, even 100, 200 years later? Simply these words can be interpreted and twisted by sort of shekel grubbing lawyers and various experts from courts and judges and magistrates. I think there's a lot of consideration that needs to go into this, and probably this is one of the main monarchist arguments against constitutionalism, parliamentary monarchy, things like that, which are trying to be spoon-fed into us, at least as Orthodox Christians and as Christians in general, who sometimes advocate for monarchy, autocracy. Is that they say, well, how about we water it down and introduce a constitution, some constitutional laws? But as we see with this Texas issue, literally it's a life or death situation for Texans, and this is just the beginning. This is just the first wave of migrants, and again, you have constitutional lawyers, experts, and judges, even in the Supreme Court itself, who are stating that the state itself cannot protect its own personal interests. I mean, this is what we call, I mean, what I've tweeted about calling it civilizational sabotage from the inside. It's happening in America at the moment. And yeah, I agree with Conrad, that, there is no imminent risk of civil war at the moment, just because I think timeline wise, we're still early on in the year. People returning from holidays, more or less the people of America are really relaxed. And I think, generally speaking, if this was taking place in October, November, end of 2024, I think things could be escalating out of control. But fortunately for us, the timing is quite perfect. And I think we won't see that sort of deterioration of relations between, the state of Texas and the federal government. I think, and, judging by what Joe Biden's doing at the moment, he's kind of probably got a shot of adrenochrome in the morning. So he's waking up, he's sending letters around. He's actually understanding that something needs to be done, or else there's a risk that he will outright lose the presidential race, and no amount of electoral machinations will sort of get him out of the situation. So generally speaking, it's good that Texas is standing its ground against these waves and hordes of illegal immigrants. And for all those folks arguing that, hey, these are just peaceful Catholic people trying to cross the border, like, naturally, I think arguments can be made about the majority of these people being Roman Catholics or Christians. But again, why aren't they staying in Mexico, which is Mexico is not a bad place to live. It's a second world country. It's actually quite comfortable, especially if you're a hardworking person. I think people downplay the Mexican factor, calling it a third world or this criminal ridden. Yes, there are criminal cartels and mafias, but if you're living in one of the main cities, you should be completely fine. I mean, it can't even be compared to a country like Brazil, I think. So there's definitely arguments can be made against this push by the liberals and liberal Christians, even within the Catholic Church, because this is a major factor. We keep mentioning the fact that the Roman Catholics are this massive conservative group, pushing against illegal immigration. It's exactly the opposite. Roman Catholics are, in fact, these Roman Catholic NGOs, Roman Catholic talk show, essentially these liberal bishops as well, saying that America should actually let this Roman Catholic illegal immigrant wave into the United States, and this would somehow benefit the American population. I don't think that's the case, and I think the statistics that they have are wrong. I think actually the position of those particular spokespersons from the Roman Catholic Church, the picture that they paint of the Roman Catholic religion at the moment is that it's in a state of complete liberal dysphoria. It is a overall delusion that we see personified in the figure of Pope Francis in recent statements, the pro-gay blessings, things like that. But of course, in relation to border control and migration, we see this across Europe. None of these Catholic countries are actually benefiting from Catholicism's position on migration in general, let alone illegal immigration. So it's a larger commentary on the actual situation on the ground in America, I think.
Well, and you mentioned it, but it's not even really even mostly Mexicans. It's Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, and now Africans coming up from Mexico, some of them through the Darien Gap, Central America, coming up facilitated by the cartels, Jewish NGOs, as well as some Catholic ones, of course. And it's the great replacement. It's the intentional replacement of white Europeans in America as the core population. And it's already, too late. The current population is about 57% European white. And that doesn't even necessarily account for the full understanding of illegal immigration in the country. So, I mean, there's like tens of millions of illegal immigrants already in the country at this point, with hundreds of thousands coming in every month. And while it does seem that, like you said, we're not headed to civil war because Joe Biden would be committing electoral suicide, at this point, immigration has become the number one issue for voters in 2024. 35% of poll respondents say it's their number one issue in the election, which is obviously a really good sign for Republicans. And Joe Biden, like you said, you sent that letter to the Senate. He seems that he isn't trying to press Border Patrol. Again, the Border Patrol union says they don't even want to cut the wires. So he seems to know that he doesn't exactly have full amount of support here. But behind the scenes, he does seem to be working to punish Texas. He doesn't want to take this sitting down, of course. This is a statement from President Biden. He made a decision to pause pending approvals of liquefied natural gas exports. And like 90% of LNG exports come from Texas. It's one of the biggest points in the Texas economy down in the, Houston, Galveston industrial energy sector. And this is from Philip Pilkington. He said, Europe was promised LNG by the U.S. after cutting Russian buying. They were lied to. Electoral politics is more important than a core ally, apparently. Biden pulls the LNG terminals, even though Qatari LNG has to take the long route due to Red Sea attacks. And this is obviously going to contribute to the energy war. Perhaps, Biden wants to keep some LNG for America if we're going to be struggling to keep up a reserve. But again, this would severely damage the Texas economy if we weren't allowed to export, liquefied natural gas. So again, a lot of people are saying this is effectively a sanction on Texas, basically, for defying the federal government. So Very interesting developments to say the least. Again, we don't see this becoming a civil war per se, but it is, the lines are being drawn, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think just conclusive thoughts. Like, if hypothetically this was to occur or extend somehow, if this crisis was to extend all the way up to the election and it would escalate into like a large scale civil war, and this is completely speculative, most likely won't take place. This would, of course, essentially all the predictions we made over the last year for 2024 would essentially change. The world outlay would change. The China's economy would suffer. The European economy would fall into great stagnation. There'd be a recession. I mean, most world currencies would suffer. Russia would, of course, suffer greatly because, again, the price of oil and gas would plummet because the demand would also plummet. If America was to enter into some civil state of enormous disobedience, shall we call civil war, if we must, of course, Mexico would probably get involved as well, at least in some of those border territories. It would be complete chaos and crisis. And unfortunately, I don't think countries like Russia, would be in a position to militarily take advantage. We will speak about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in the future, but Russia did not mobilize any additional troops in 2023. So as it stands right now, the Russian army is purely in defensive position. So if, for example, you would say, well, the US is overextended in its foreign policy and throughout the international waters, what if domestically something was to take place between Texas and the federal government and some other states siding with Texas, like, say, a civil war 2.0, which would be horrendous on the ground, naturally, but could countries like Russia and China take advantage of it? I doubt that supremely, because these countries, I don't think anyone in the world at the moment is prepared, really. I think we're in the state of preparation, but if something like this was to be set off very early, at least in 2024, the consequences would be quite dire, I think, for everybody involved. None of these countries are ready to take advantage of what potentially could take place in Texas and the US. So I think it would be beneficial if Biden completely capitulates to the cause of the Republicans in this particular moment. I think it would benefit the international players around the world, and also it might sober up the Biden administration to maybe act with a bit more vigilance, not just domestically, but in its foreign policy, especially in relation to countries like Israel, perhaps, like to soften support and soften all these massive donations that they're giving to the Netanyahu government.
And of course, Abbott and a lot of these Republican governors, most of them, DeSantis, obviously, they love Israel as well, Abbott. And now he's in India, so, he's full on Zog, Pu-and-Lu alliance. He's part of that. So that being said, I respect him for at least doing this on the border. And I want to talk about this on the LNG situation. Dawn Buckingham, the land commissioner of Texas, used to be my state senator. She said Texas is the country's largest natural gas exporter and the third largest in the world. This reckless move is nothing more than retaliation against Texas for standing up to this administration over the border. And this, our favorite, late night tweeter, Dmitry Medvedev, tweeted, he posted out on all of his platforms that the formation of the Texas People's Republic is becoming more and more real. What I wrote at the end of the year before last in a joking prediction is coming true. And he goes on a whole long spiel on X about, Texit and all of those kinds of things. And, it's a bit, there's the potential this year of having Texit on the ballot. The Texas Republican Party is totally rejecting the legitimate process that was followed. Over 139,000 signatures were gathered to have Texit on the Republican ballot this year, and the Republican Party is just refusing to have it. The process was followed, and they should have a question to the people: should the state of Texas reassert its status as an independent nation? That's the question, and that should be on the ballot based on the amount of signatures. But the party is stonewalling it. So, Texas is moving forward. So be sure to follow the Texas Nationalist Movement and all of them on Twitter and whatnot to support, if you support Texas becoming an independent nation, which would be pretty incredible. But I think we've done the border and Texas justice at this point. I think we have to move on to some other borders, specifically Israel's northern border, as Hezbollah effectively escalates to Hezbollah and Israel, at Israel's behest, it seems, with Netanyahu and the unity government and the war cabinet basically saying that they think the time is now to escalate and start a full-on war and take out Hezbollah. I mean, Ben Shapiro in his recent debate said that at the very beginning, Israel should have just gone in and taken out Hezbollah. So it seems to be the general consensus among world Jewry that it's up next is Hezbollah, and it's going to be an even longer, bigger war. So, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on the widening situation in the Holy Land?
I mean, all these calls to actually have Israel move in against Hezbollah and Lebanon proper, because it would be a breach of Lebanese sovereignty. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this would be a direct declaration of war. It wouldn't be a peacekeeping operation. Lebanon as a country did not declare war on Israel yet. Naturally, Hezbollah is operating on its own accord, sending in drones, using long-range bombardments of IDF positions on the northern border of Israel with with Lebanon, of course. But these calls internally as well as externally through figures such as Ben Shapiro, being an American citizen, as well as actual Israelis calling for Israel to take preeminent action, move in a few kilometers deep into Lebanon and actually clear out some of these Hezbollah bases. Primarily, of course, we're talking about like which exact targets I think we're looking at here was recently in the last 24 hours, actually, military strikes have been carried out against the Hezbollah airstrip. So these are very small airports, are hidden by trees mostly, but positioned quite close to the Israeli border, which Hezbollah allegedly is using to actually launch some of its larger drones to enact bombardments on Israeli targets. So, of course, Israel is retaliating by shooting long-range missiles as well as not artillery strikes, but actually using some of its own drones to actually take out these airports and damage them to a point where the airstrip the concrete is so destroyed that you simply cannot drive any planes or machines on these things for quite some time. So naturally, and of course, the demoralization factor is there as well, that the Lebanese people working around these airstrips will probably move elsewhere because there's always the preeminent chance that, hey, Israel may actually drop a bomb on you. So they're trying to scare the Lebanese people into submitting, moving north away from this border, which it considers its own sort of suzerainty, its own controlled territory. Naturally, I mean, this is like a breach of multiple international law sort of statutes. But again, the situation, I think, as Nasrallah described a couple of months ago, the Lebanese Hezbollah people are considering this a holy war, not a war for Hamas, but a war for all Muslim people to liberate themselves and liberate the Palestinian state, sort of from the river to the sea, so to speak, quote unquote. We're sort of promoting the fact that the Lebanese people are standing up for their neighbors in the south. And Israel understands this, and they understand that at this point, Hezbollah is not going to concede at all. Hezbollah is looking to repeat perhaps what has taken place in 2006 in the war between Israel and Lebanon, or Israel and Hezbollah, but to a more favorable extent in Hezbollah's favor. And in fact, Hezbollah has been preparing. I mean, it's been it's been almost 20 years since that last conflict, which took place between the two countries. And I think Hezbollah has been training, preparing, and has learnt many very favorable lessons from that particular conflict. And despite the fact that Israel's army is a lot stronger than Hezbollah, there's still that potential of actually, just like what Hamas is doing, baiting Israel deep into Lebanese territory a few kilometers in and then surrounding them, causing issues, causing disruptions to the logistics lines. And the IDF has really shown itself a lot weaker than it has been in decades past. I mean, a lot of the IDF conscripts look like they're young men, like it's quite egalitarian, a lot of young women, a lot of people of, shall we say, confused orientation as well. Like there's a lot of people doing weird TikTok dances. People like, are these people ready to go, several miles into hostile territory in Lebanon in order to clear out some airstrips and some bunkers of that Hezbollah's holding? I kind of doubt that. I think it would be a quest which Israel should probably not undertake at this point. And I think, if anything, Israel should probably seek peace with the Lebanese people and Hezbollah and sort of come to some sort of peace agreement. Generally, this would favor Israel, naturally, but we understand from Netanyahu, from the recent conclusion of the ICJ, and from Israel's reaction to the ICJ, interim decision, that Israel is not looking to actually seek any sort of peace agreement with Hamas, let alone like Hezbollah. They're incredibly stubborn, and the chief stubborn person at the point is Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's actually leading the charge into Israel's you can call it a national suicide at this point.
And while we are seeing pullbacks from Gaza, specifically Gaza City and whatnot, we are seeing, however, some of the fiercest fighting since the beginning of Israel's ground operation into the Strip in Khan Yunis at this point, parts farther south. So the entire Strip, of course, wants to be cleared out. Listen to our episode last week with Jim Jatras. We talk about the Philadelphia corridor and the dispute with Egypt and Israel, and how Israel wants to control part of the border with Egypt and effectively have some jurisdiction on what is effectively Egyptian territory, which the Egyptians do not accept. So this whole thing is still very hot between all the Islamic neighbors. There is some talk about UAE or Saudi-controlled Gaza Strip in the future, which I think the Israelis would love, but of course that's not really going to be accepted by the wider Muslim world at this point. And of course the broader Iranian crescent, the Shia crescent, whether it's the Houthis or Hezbollah or the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and then the Syrian forces as well, have been launching missiles. Recently, you have a report that the Houthis Ansar Allah have successfully struck a UK chemical ship. I think it was hauling oil, the Marlin Luanda, which there's videos of it on fire, and I've seen purported videos now confirmed of it sinking into the sea. So this could be a bit of an escalation, which again, we have seen the US strike hundreds of sites across Yemen at this point, despite the fact that the White House vehemently denies being at war with the Houthis. it's definitely an aerial bombardment war to a certain degree that, in coalition with Operation Prosperity Guardian, it's a pretty serious not war, to say the least. But the Houthis don't seem to be backing down, and of course Hezbollah, they've launched Iranian-made third-generation ATGM Almas 3, which are much more substantial rockets than Israel has been dealing with from Hamas since the beginning of this war. Like, these things can, really strike at longer distances and can carry much more ordnance. So Hezbollah is bringing out, the bigger guns, quite literally. And it does appear that some of the pullout from Gaza City is about, and this has been stated by Israeli authorities, relocating them to the northern front and preparing for the widening of this conflict. And the bombardment of southern Lebanon is a constant. They want the people to clear out, not because they want to prevent civilian casualties, but because they want all of this region, closer to the current Israeli borders and farther out, like we said in the last episode, from the Nile to the Euphrates. They want people cleared out. They want Arabs, Goyim, Christians, Muslims, mostly Christians, of course, cleared out from this region. And they want it to be a solely Jewish state. And the fact that Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu have explicitly stated that they do want Jewish supremacy and Jewish Israeli security control over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank proves that they're always the maximalists of what they think they can get. They're not going to spill the spaghetti on everything. Like, even though they do like to put up Greater Israel maps with their finance minister, and when other Kahanists like to do things, they totally show like their actual aspirations. But Netanyahu and others, they always say like, oh no, we're just in the realms of this, West Bank, Gaza has to say for us, we want this. But the moment they get that, it's going to be, well, actually, this territory, actually, Sinai, we really do need, well, actually, southern Lebanon, it's always going to be more, never enough. So this idea that, again, even the Palestinians don't want a Palestinian two-state solution at this point. They recognize that it's a one-state solution for either side at this point, which of course does not bode well for ceasefire in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we do see countries like Saudi Arabia, of course, contributing to this war against the Houthis and Ansar Allah. Naturally, at this point, Saudi Arabia has been shooting down Houthi missiles headed for Israel. We've mentioned that a few weeks ago. But the new inclusion of Saudi Arabian contribution to this massive coalition was positioning long-range artillery along its border in the north. And as the US, France, and the UK send its bombers and, of course, shoot missiles from their ships onto specific Houthi targets in Yemen, Saudi Arabia contributes by shooting long-range artillery from the Saudi Arabian border into Yemen itself. So again, of course, this artillery doesn't shoot that far. These missiles, they fly several tens, if not hundreds of kilometers at most. But we still have to consider that Saudi Arabia is quietly, not really announcing it, but still taking this position of being a very strong U.S. ally. Like, let's not forget that Donald Trump and Saudi Arabia did sign the largest arms deal, the second largest arms deal in human history since World War II, the Lend-Lease. Of course, this Saudi Arabian arms deal, in total, it's supposed to equate to something over 300 billion American dollars in a decade of trade. So Saudi Arabia by 2030 will be one of the most armored countries in the Middle East, I would say, if not the entire world. Its military capacity should theoretically increase to some enormous capacity. So that's what we kind of need to expect Saudi Arabia's position on this conflict and how it exactly develops. Naturally, especially given the condemnation of the ICJ and further developments in Europe, the slowing down of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Now all the eyes of the world, despite this particular Texas situation, are essentially on the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia, really the Crown Prince himself and the King of Saudi Arabia, that do need to answer for their stance on, given the fact that they have Mecca and Medina, the two sort of Islamic holy sites, they do have to answer for the Muslim world as the sort of caretakers of that particular religion and that particular world region. So it'll be very interesting to see exactly how their position progresses, considering the fact that, well, Islam has received quite a bad rap over the last few decades, being accused of predominantly being responsible, and we're talking about Salafists and Wahhabists in general, but also like Al-Qaeda and other CIA-supported groups such as ISIS. But Islam has been the main sort of recipient of accusations of terrorist acts. And frankly, Conrad, noticed this, right? 7th of October occurs, and naturally this is called like a large terrorist action, but it almost looked like a military act, if anything. But since that point, despite the fact that the US presence against Houthis, against, supporting the Israeli bombardment of Palestinians, we've seen, I think, if anything, a very controlled, some of these very honorable Islamic organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, we've seen a very controlled situation. We don't see any suicide bombings. We don't see any extreme, crazy terrorist acts across Western countries in the US, in Europe, in Russia, things like that. Things like even that we didn't even.
No, we just see Israel and the U.S. activating ISIS, and then immediately,
Exactly.
suicide bombing, killing 70 plus people in Iran, all sorts of stuff like that. And of course, what did Joe Biden do recently, one of the first things he did as president was delist the Houthis as a terrorist organization, and now they're back on the terrorist list so that they can be, bombed harder and harder. And again, I understand that there's a more justifiable on the world stage interest in protecting shipping and world trade and whatnot, but again, tell Israel to stop bombing all the areas around it. Don't, you punish the Houthis. There's other powers that want to use their leverage to hold up world trade and do other things while Israel does this. You can stop all of that by reigning in Israel, right? So it's definitely it just totally betrays where the loyalty really lies.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think this is just one of those things that I think every Muslim in the world, those who still adhere to real traditional Sunni Shia values, really need to internalize and understand that the last 20, 30 years there's been enormous machinations and manipulations of Islam through these Western and Mossad sources. I mean, that's just the conclusions they need to come to, and that Islam has been used as this battering ram, not even against Western countries, but against themselves, first and foremost, in order to support this project of the greater Israel. And we Orthodox Christians, we were kind of on the sidelines just watching this take place and watching this progress kind of, over the last 30 years, we're kind of watching this massive scenario play out in the Middle East. And now at this point, we're personally involved as recipients of collateral damage and as the victims at, St. Porphyrius Church and various other monasteries, and potentially even more targets if this war between Hezbollah and Israel escalates. There's a lot of Christians living in Lebanon, as we remember from the Lebanese civil war. A lot of Christians suffered from what took place in those areas, and even more, unfortunately, will be suffered and probably will be targeted by the IDF if they enter into Lebanon, in a full-on preliminary confrontation with Hezbollah and against the Lebanese armed forces. It will be very tragic and very dangerous, I think, for shall we say, interreligious relations in that Middle East area.
Yeah, and again, we've seen certain, specifically Maronite Catholics, much more siding with the Lebanese authorities, who some say would even be willing to side with Israel against Hezbollah. So the factionalism goes very deep. But we're going to move towards Russia, Ukraine at this point. Of course, things have not been dying down there. It's just World War III is spreading, so it's harder to keep up with every front, right? But between this huge plane being shot down with, 67 Ukrainian POWs or 50 plus Ukrainian POWs, 60 plus total people on board dead in this huge crash shot down by American or French missiles from Ukrainian ground sources. And then there's been severe civilian bombings of Donetsk. The intensity, and it kind of seems like desperation and slow, like, again, just kind of consequence of the collapse and desperation of the Ukrainian regime. Dimitri, what's kind of the background on these incidents?
I think what really shows the breakdown of Ukrainian internal communications, right? This Ilyushin Il-76 massive, it's not a cargo plane, it's a troop transportation plane, but in this particular case, it was carrying specifically neo-Nazi POWs, right? Let's just call it what they are. A lot of them were members of the Azov battalion, troops captured for a long time ago, and they were actually, the plane was traveling near the Belgorod, Ukraine, Kharkov border, so pretty dangerous territory, but nevertheless, this massive plane was in the air. The plane actually does not have any defenses or missiles on it, so essentially it even looks like a small commercial airliner for all sorts, if you even Google the image of an Ilyushin plane. And yes, it had all those neo-Nazi POWs on board, and Ukraine essentially just shot it down. And of course, the plane, because of it's so large, once the anti-air missile did hit the plane, the pilots very bravely commanded the plane and controlled it into the ground away from essentially it exploded in the forest, and it didn't fly into Belgorod or any populated village or anything of that sort. So yeah, the Russian pilots were heroes in that capacity. They knew the plane was going to go down. There's no escape. It's not like, it's not a movie. You can't jump out of a parachute. Once the plane's hit like that, everything's jammed, and essentially it's just death is almost inevitable and guaranteed. So, and instead of naturally, let's see, how did the Ukrainians react to this? Because it's their own people, their own elite sort of Azov battalion, those crazed neo-Nazi pagans who they kept promoting in their media over the last year and a half, and even we can say 10 years at this point, since 2014. How did Zelensky and his people react to the death of these so-called Slavo-Ukraini heroes? Well, they didn't react at all. At first they said, well, wow, we shot the plane down. Yes, they're POWs, they're traitors. It's like, okay. And then they denied this. And now the official version is, well, maybe we did shoot them down, but it's because the Russians intentionally flew the plane over our territory, so we were kind of baited into it. So the version keeps changing, and we don't see any mourning whatsoever from Zelensky or any of the Ukrainian officials. No one's mourning the loss of their own elite soldiers, shall we say. So this whole position that Ukrainians actually care, or the Ukrainian government actually cares about its own prisoners, its own people, I think completely scatters. There's no, and even Metropolitan Epiphany, Patriarch Philaret, these false schismatic hierarchs of the Ukrainian church, none of them have held any funeral, any mourning services for these dead POWs and they're all confirmed dead because we saw really gnarly footage of like the plane crash and in the forest, and the Russian forensic squads have already arrived on the scene in the Belgorod Oblast, and they've actually inspected. You can see there's arms and legs lying around, and a lot of these Ukrainian soldiers actually had, like, shall we say, like neo-Nazi tattoos, a lot of them runes, wolves, angels, swastikas, black suns, and you can actually tell who they belong to. It's like, okay, well, this is clearly a Ukrainian neo-Nazi, and these are like his body parts right here. I mean, this is quite gnarly, but it's quite obvious that a lot of the victims were Ukrainians, and where's the mourning? Where's from the Ukrainian position, it's just absent. And meanwhile, I compare this to how the Russians reacted to the criminal bombardment of Donetsk on the 25th of January of the Donetsk. Literally, it was a Sunday after church. People went to coffee hour in the city of Donetsk, right? Avdiivka is being a stage, so the risk of the Donetsk bombardment is quite low at this point. And the people in Donetsk went to the marketplace to sort of sell goods, just like you'd go out, just hang out with your family, and the Ukrainians lobbed a long-range artillery strike right all over. And this is probably a HIMARS of some sort. These things can fire from hundreds of kilometers away. They shot this right in the city, in the center of Donetsk. They hit a street market with 0 troops, of course, no military targets, and they killed outright 27 or 28 Donetsk residents, men, women, babushkas, people just literally coming out of church, killed, including children as well. And I think as many as 50 people are injured at the moment. The Metropolitan of Donetsk at the moment, just like Metropolitan John of Belgorod, who was present in the hospital after the bombardment of Belgorod just a few weeks ago in early 2024, is now with the people in the hospital. But again, it's just a tragedy. And look, of course, the Russians are reacting like in a very controlled, patient fashion. They're mourning for their losses, and they understand that this is a particular war crime. The Ukrainians, instead of doing that, they're just blaming their own POW troops for surrendering to the Russian side, and they don't really care that 60 plus people, their own soldiers, have died, despite the fact that they were neo-Nazis and whatnot, but they don't even care about their own troops. So I think this really paints a picture of exactly how the war has mentally and I would say morally destroyed certain factions in the war, especially I would say on the Ukrainian end. I think people are tired of the war, and some people have just been dehumanized, right? Like internally, they just morally cannot comprehend the loss of their own people, and it's not even a tragedy anymore. They've seen so much death that even 60 people dying in a plane crash is no longer a significant event.
No, it's a real tragedy, and it shows that it's not going to be pretty necessarily as Ukraine goes down. There might be some pretty sad outbursts, some pretty unfortunate, I guess, casualties and collateral damage that come with the fall of this, propped up zombie regime. But speaking of tragedy, again, not quite as dramatic or depressing of a tragedy, but a tragedy nonetheless. In the midst of the upcoming Russian presidential elections, one of our favorite characters, Igor Girkin, has been sentenced to 4 years in prison. And we'd been following this case for a while. We'd been following him and been fans before his arrest, of course. And this is an unfortunate development. And of course, it is said that he can appeal in 6 months, which would be when the election is all done with and whatnot, which we're hoping that will actually happen and he'll be able to be paroled and actually, be a free man once again. But this is an unfortunate development, of course. And as far as the presidential election goes, we all know Putin is going to win, and it's a bit of an exciting development because once this kind of hurdle of entering into his, I believe an unprecedented is a 6th term or whatever it is, he will be kind of officially entering into the stage where he must be considering, the succession question and who will come after him. So maybe within this term we'll get some answers on that. But Dmitry, what do we think is going to be happening to our good friend, Mr. Girkin?
So at the moment, Igor Strelkov is sitting in a fairly comfortable prison, all things considered, despite the fact that he does have a heart condition, so he's not necessarily eligible to sign up for the armed forces, in the prison battalion, or like some sort of Wagner prisoner unit. He's not actually going to be doing that, given the fact that he's over 50 and he does have these debilitating factors health-wise, right? So he is taking tablets for his heart condition. So there's an excuse for him not to be involved on the front line. So a lot of people are commenting, well, now he can actually join the armed forces again. And it's like, no, he was actually a lot more useful as an analyst online, giving us the scoop on a lot of these occurrences in Russia from a very patriotic right-wing perspective, and an Orthodox one at that. Mind you, he's a very pious Orthodox Christian, and he has been for at least 20 years since the late 1990s, which is, I would say, quite a long time considering the absence of catechism for a lot of these Soviet people who grew up in the Union. But let's just consider, like, Igor Strelkov, they've gave him 4 years of prison with possibility of parole after, I believe, 6 months, which roughly aligns with, I would say, the end of probably a little bit soon after Easter, he would be able to apply for parole through his lawyers and attorneys, and he could essentially be released on good on good conditions, maybe they'll put on some restrictions and some conditions on his release, such as he can't post anything on social media or something like that, or he can't run any Telegram accounts. Who knows, right? But it is good news. So he's sitting in Matrosskaya Tishina, which is a pretty comfortable prison, Moscow-wise. I know a few people sitting there at the moment, and you are given like televisions, books to read, comfortable like Adidas tracksuit pants, things like that. So it's not like it's not like a Siberian Shizor type prison where we saw a lot of people get sent for similar cases and for Section 282. Remind you, he is sitting in prison for essentially a law against hate speech, not hate speech, but extremism, shall we say. Section 282 is pretty extreme. So Russia, so yeah, Americans, you guys are very lucky at the moment because you do have, the First Amendment, so the freedom of speech, which I think, let's not take that for granted. At the moment, Americans can actually speak their mind, criticize Biden, criticize a lot of what's happening without actually being held accountable for their words in a legal capacity. So I think that's one of the main benefits of the American Constitution. But so Igor Strelkov, right? I agree with you, Conrad. After the election, there's a high chance he'll be granted parole and he'll be released, which is a really good thing. But generally, this is a very negative thing because it paints the Russian legal system and the prosecutorial system as something of a fifth column. And, Alexander Dugin, Malafeev, figures like this have been speaking about a potential fifth column in the Russian government bureaucratic system for a long time. And we've been describing this fifth column as this, as like a deep swamp in Russia. And perhaps maybe those people are really aligned with the liberals. But at this point, it looks like the swamp may be even masquerading as like patriots, perhaps. Maybe the deep swamp is actually the chief prosecutor's office of Russia, as well as maybe some of the attorney generals sitting there. Who knows? Like at this point, I'm looking at, there's probably any possibility who is involved in the Russian deep swamp, similar to how during the Trump administration, a lot of his actions were stifled and, put down by internal sabotage from some of the people who we thought were patriots and weren't liberals, but then turned into these members, these various heads of a large, so shall we say, Masonic, Judeo-Masonic Hydra. So in Russia, I think it's a similar situation. It's like Putin himself put Strelkov behind bars. I think people trying to sabotage Putin's image amongst patriots by sentencing Strelkov, the judge, the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor, the attorney general. There are people involved responsible, and there's a chance Putin doesn't even know this is taking place, mind you. There's a chance he's not even listening or watching the news that closely. I think he's reading military government reports. So to blame Putin for this particular occurrence of Strelkov, I think it's shooting a little bit early, and we just have to keep that in mind. So it's not like a Putin versus Strelkov moment. It's more like there's a fifth column inside of Russia which is trying to sabotage the Orthodox patriotic uprising by taking care of people like Prigozhin and Wagner, and even putting Strelkov behind bars. So there's really there's a fight within Russia itself, a fight for Russia's future, which I think will become a lot more explicit moving into the future. And at the moment, it's really tight, closely involved with the SMO and what's happening in Ukraine. But as that develops further, I think, we'll see some interesting developments. And I just want to mention, let's talk about Boris Spiegel, famous Russian Judeo, shall we say, Russo-Israeli oligarch who actually got sentenced at the same time as Strelkov to 11 years of prison. He's a former Russian senator, and he was charged with corruption for embezzling funds during the COVID pandemic, as well as selling some very dodgy anti-COVID medication and being, involved in that whole vaccine scheme in Russia in 2021. So a very famous, I guess, one of the only openly Israeli Russian oligarchs was sentenced to 11 years in prison for COVID machinations. It's almost like a dream come true. I mean, if not for the Strelkov sentence, it would be like, wow, it'd be a great week that finally, there's a crackdown on these weird kabad type oligarchs and elites in Russia. And this man, for contributing to the various issues in Russian culture throughout the decades, and at this point even making money from the COVID pandemic, from the poor Russian people, has now finally been sentenced and put away. So this is really good news, and I guess bad news for Boris Spiegel, that maybe he can learn a thing or two in prison.
Yeah, I mean, he of course was the head of the Finnish Anti-Fascist Committee, all sorts of random Jewish organizations like, the Russian Jewish Federation Council, all sorts of different organizations that we've talked about on some of the episodes on Ether Hour in the past, like our episode about the Russian deep state. But when it comes to other prisoners that have been sentenced and are languishing in Russian prison, I guess, there also have been recent developments about Navalny, who a few weeks back we reported has gone missing, but he's back. His location is known again, and he's complaining about every morning the prison plays that shaman song, I'm Russian, and he has to wake up to that. So that's where Navalny is at. But of course, pray for the servant of God, Igor. We hope that Strelkov can be out on the streets in 6 months. And again, you're right, he probably won't be returning to Telegram anytime soon, but we would still like to hear his commentary because he's one of the few people that understands the World War now perspective. He talks about the drift towards conflict with Turkey, the Third World War, how the fronts in the Caucasus and Syria can all lead to all of these sorts of things. He's very much on the same wavelength as we are here. So we would love to get some more of his commentary. But unless you have anything else to say about that, Dimitri, we should probably discuss some of the likely offensive stuff with Russia before we move to the rest of Europe.
Yeah, I think at the moment, look, we're looking at a very close slowing down, right? As we're already past the middle point of winter at this point in Russia and Eastern Europe. It's looking like the Russian Federation is going to slow down its offensive in the SMO, focusing primarily just on the defensive positions it's holding now, as well as this, long-suffering town of Avdiivka, which Russia has been sieging for a little while, and the Ukrainians are holding to, similar to Bakhmut till the last man, so to speak, in very stubborn fashion at this point. But Avdiivka is the only target we're looking at that the Russians will probably take prior to the election, which roughly aligns with the beginning of Great Lent, so about 17th of March 2024. So that's when the presidential election in Russia will be announced, and that's when it will be completed. I believe the Ukrainian election is in April, so we're looking at that particular time frame. And before then, probably no major developments will take place in the front lines. Perhaps, of course, there may be some strengthening of the borders between Kharkov and Belgorod. Again, I doubt Russia will be, taking on any massive operations of surrounding Kharkov or doing anything crazy like that. But there will be militias organized. The militias have already been organized in the Bryanskaya, Belgorodskaya Oblast, this is the northern oblasti. We're very deep and dense forests, which need to be patrolled, but the Russian soldiers simply, there's not enough people to cover. I mean, we're talking about the Texas border, right? There's a Russo-Ukrainian border, which Ukrainian extremists have been crossing for a few months now, and sometimes causing terrorist acts and things on Russian territory. So these borders need to be controlled as well by, Russia doesn't have a National Guard. It does, but there's simply not enough people to actually control this vast, dense area. So they're actually arming local Russian militias to take care of these particular defensive positions, which I think that will be the development on that front. So at this point, it looks like, despite all these provocational strikes against Belgorod, Donetsk, the shooting down of this prisoner warplane, I think Russia will be very steadfast and hold strong and really kind of not fall to any provocations, especially prior to this presidential election, because at this point, Putin has not actually shown us any sign that there is a successor being prepared, and nobody has received enough PR to actually be labeled politically as a successor. And this is important because Putin himself, in his early presidential races in like 2003, for example, he suffered greatly by being pressured by both communists, the LDPR, Zhirinovsky's party. A lot of people actually, there was a chance Putin was going to lose one of his early elections, right? If not for some of the people behind him in early United Russia. Once Yeltsin actually passed on power to Putin. So if Putin didn't prove himself early on, it was going to be very hard for him. But naturally, he now cemented himself as a strong leader. And without a proper succession in place and without a proper transition and even a preparation in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of the Russian boomer population, of a succeeding figure, I'm not sure if the transition will be as smooth as we'd hope it would be for Russia at the moment. Even if Russia remains in the semi-dictatorial bureaucratic state, which it is in right now, where it presents itself as a democracy, but in very fact, it's just the strong Siloviki right-wing conservative and very greatly orthodoxing, shall we say, the orthodoxy is increasing, let's just say, steadfast in this Russian bureaucratic system. So that's a good thing. But without a successor, it doesn't look too good. So Putin's hopefully will stay in power for the next 6 years or so and kind of prepare the country for whatever's next to come. And hopefully that thing will be, as we've spoken about, preparation for a future Orthodox rise and maybe better things like that in terms of, we're speaking about the political sphere.
No, I agree. And I think as far as Ukraine goes, it seems that both parties are starting to look outside of Ukraine, unfortunately, as the conflict is kind of broadening in that regard. Of course, we have the chair of the NATO Military Committee, Dutch Admiral Robert Bauer. He warned recently, he said, peace is not guaranteed. We are preparing for a war with Russia and its terrorist groups. Maybe not tomorrow, but certainly within the next 20 years. People should be prepared for the first 36 hours. So quite a dramatic, kind of spooky statements from him. This is all in the midst of Sweden just entering NATO. Turkey, the parliament approved it. So it's all said and done at this point that Sweden, on top of Finland now, will be entering NATO. So that's all of Scandinavia in NATO now. They all joined NATO before they even joined the EU. So interesting advancement there. And in the midst of all of this as well, General Sir Patrick Sanders, the British, I believe, head of the military, said, if we go to war with Russia, we could find that our youth may have to be conscripted. So this bizarre shift towards these British, these European military leaders, all kind of, we heard it in Sweden a few weeks back as well, other places, Germany has been saying it, Olaf Scholz has talked about it. So I guess there might have come some news from America that, hey, you guys need to be prepared to take Russia on your own and distract on this flank while we take on China, or while we, if you think about certain things going a certain way, or while we fight an internal civil conflict here in the United States between the states or whatever it is that may happen in a 10-year timeline between the federal government and other power structures. But it does seem that these European countries are still vassalized completely and would be willing on their own regard to fight against Russia, which is truly unfortunate development. But the populist right-wing movements, that will only boost them. I mean, that prospect of war will only boost the rising right-wing dissidents and identitarians across Europe. Of course, the AfD is surging in every poll across Germany, and the cosmopolitan libtards of Germany are freaking out. They're like, no, no, you can't talk about deporting migrants. You're doing a heckin' fascerino, and that's not allowed. So the heads of the AfD had started talking about, remigration and deporting and sending certain migrants home, especially those that had committed crimes. And the people of Germany they just saw swastikas everywhere the moment they heard that and just freaked out. So in the midst of this, of course, there's the German farmers and the French farmers who were really rising up. There was proposed tax increases in the French legislature, and the French farmers really went all out. They burned down prefecture police buildings, they covered prefecture buildings in poop, they mobilized en masse, and then the legislature backed down. They're not going to increase those taxes. And the German farmers are doing similar protests and are pledging, some pretty radical action, and are even, it seems that the real fear is that all these farmers will unite with the AfD and completely increase the rural vote that the AfD is already getting. So, and all of this does bode well for future Russia-European relations. But again, they're already talking about just banning the AfD altogether. As we've discussed in the past, Germany isn't really a real country. It's just a vassal of the United States and exists effectively to, like the government and the Constitution there exist to prevent any kind of right-wing dissident or German identitarian movement from rising up in any capacity. So it's really, it's really going to be what the US ultimately and the intelligence communities and the deep states here decide they want to do with these parties. But it would be very interesting to see what happens if some massive electoral victory for the AfD occurs in Germany.
Yeah, we have to just keep in mind countries like Poland, Germany, France, they actually supported Zelensky banning some of the conservative right-wing parties in Ukraine, the alternative parties like the Party of the Regions, which was very popular in Lugansk, Donetsk, and it was banned at the beginning of the SMO completely. All the deputies who were members of it were kicked out of the parliament. We have to just consider that these countries, such as Germany, actually supported that move, and they thought it was a good idea. So there is the potential that the AfD, if there's enough popular support, that Chancellor Scholz does see that he could make this populist move, and actually against the AfD and the conservatives in Germany to actually outlaw some of these parties just because of right wing threats of right wing extremism, which we're seeing at these protests. I mean, look, these phantom fears of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich are going to do the German people a great service of injustice, I think, generally, because the German people at the moment need to look out for themselves. They've been stripped of their rights in terms of commercial trade. They've been harassed over the Nord Stream pipelines. They've been forced by their own government to give their taxpayer, Deutsche dollars and euros to Ukraine. And at the moment, even their domestic rights to actually vote for various parties, like, they're being harassed. Can you imagine in Germany if you're going to university and you're voting for the AfD, what kind of pressure is being placed on? Because again, universities in Germany are again dominated by mostly liberal academic crowd who are still teaching people about the issues surrounding the Holocaust and things which are like 80, 90 years away. I mean, I understand countries need to remember their history, but let's just be real. How does this impact the reality on the ground? And the only time we've seen Chancellor Scholz and the German powers that be, the status quo powers, speak out against the mass illegal and the mass legal immigration into Germany was during the Palestinian anti-Israeli protests, when Scholz said, well, we're going to have to look at deporting maximum 10,000 people whose values do not align with ours out of Germany. 10,000 people a year, that's like after months and months of legal process. And that's really, I mean, let's just face the facts. I think with expedited legal action, a lot more people can be potentially, shall we say, kicked out of Germany if they break certain laws, right? I'm not going to comment any further, but I think this particular immigrant crisis which Germany is facing, we've seen it in France, Sweden, the increased crime rates. This is one of the primary crises that Germany is facing at the moment, not the rising of the far right, not the return to Hitlerism and these phantom phantom fears of a Third Reich. If anything, German conservatism is more, as we mentioned, Conrad, centered around the Second Reich and maybe some, potential return to a Kaiserian, maybe like a return to more of its Holy Roman Imperial lineage, rather than anything reminiscent of, kind of Nazi Germany. And yet Nazi Germany is still being used as the sort of figurehead movement, which all blame will be placed on. It's just very peculiar. And of course, the main issue, which again is mass immigration in Germany, the subversion of German culture, and the complete destruction of German internal autonomy and sovereignty. I think that's not being spoken about. Instead, all attention is being diverted to the Russian threat, or the threat of Russian incursion and potential World War III escalation through Ukraine, and this support that needs to be given to Zelensky, who, of course, Zelensky, given that he's a member of the so-called chosen tribe, he needs to be supported unquestionably. So these things are incredibly concerning. I really feel for the German people at the moment, because they're between a rock and a hard place, and it doesn't look like it can get any better, unless, of course, the people, the farmers, the people in the cities, the actual bourgeois, stand up for their rights as sovereign conservative citizens, similar to those, of course, now imprisoned for their QAnon conspiracies, those who followed Prince Royce. People like that. We need more movements like that in Germany to return this country to a state in which it was, centuries and even 50, 60 years ago.
Well, and I think the Germans, the Reichsbürgers, I think they are in many ways kind of having their own rural, you have the kind of Trump revolution in America, and on a smaller scale, there's all these scary news stories about how in Germany, the Reichsbürgers are forming communes and compounds and buying land and starting schools and forming an alternative society. So power to you. I was going to say Burger Bros, but that means Americans. So power to you, power to you, Reich Bros. But German, the stuff sounds cool. There's no denying it. But yeah, the European situation is, like I said in the post when we were talking about Texas, it seems that Biden is more concerned with punishing Texas for not letting enough brown people flood into the country, as opposed to just providing Europeans with basic energy needs that they need to take on, since completely alienating and cutting off Russia at the behest of the United States. So the Europeans really need to reconsider the one-way alliance with the US and be like, man, would the Russians be treating us this way? Because I think there's a good chance that they wouldn't if similar situations were happening in reverse. So much to ponder from the European perspective. But going a little bit south in Europe, some big news happening in Greece amidst the church. Of course, the Ecumenical Patriarchate came out with a statement against gay marriage. We'll maybe read a few details on that in a second. But the even more exciting news is that Mount Athos, in a collective statement, of course, I think we discussed this briefly previously, they said that they will not be formally welcoming Archbishop Elpidophoros of Go Arch in a formal reception that they usually do for bishops who visit the Holy Mountain. And each monastery was left to act under its own discretion effectively. And Karakalu Monastery, one of the most traditional conservative monasteries that refuses anything to do with the schismatics in Ukraine and refused to do any of the nonsense with COVID, of course. They refused to give him any kind of formal greeting. There's rumors that he even was forced to wait outside the gate for 30 plus minutes and just nobody came to greet him or anything like that. So the Holy Mountain is showing its disapproval to Elpidophoros. And recently, with a different bishop, I can't remember his name, the bishop stated that when it comes to homosexual people who have children, who adopt children, that the church will wait till those people turn 18 and then baptize them when they want to under their own volition. And Elpidophoros said he totally agreed. So he basically walked back his opinion on the gay baptism and whatnot, which it shows you that this power of, this sort of reprimand from the Holy Mountain and that unity in the monastic world can really have an effect.
Yeah, Elpidophoros is visit to Mount Athos, I think it just underlines that, yes, certain monasteries didn't greet him, and he strategically, it wasn't just him alone. There was a large group of pilgrims from America actually came with him. So I think it was quite nice generally for the monks to actually greet this group of pilgrims who probably came there for their own spiritual health and well-being, and actually grasping some of the holiness that can be obtained on the mountain in terms of grace and things like that. So Archbishop Elpidophoros, shall we say, chief amongst sinners, isn't that the sort of people that need to go to Mount Athos in the first place without promoting sort of degenerate values? I mean, probably, but again, he's a bishop. There's a lot more responsibility on him, an archbishop at that, and probably one of the foremost Greek archbishops in the world. So his particular scandalous acts, it's a good thing that the Athonite monks have spoken out against them. But what happened after this pilgrimage is even more interesting. So we're going to read this straight out of orthochristian.com. So the Archbishop Elpidophoros and the pilgrimage group then left the Holy Mountain and returned to Thessaloniki, where on January 28th, he is set to deliver a keynote address at an event commemorating commemorating the Day of the Jewish Martyrs of the Holocaust. During this event, he will be honored with the title of an honorary member of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki. This is reported by the Orthodox Times. I don't know if this requires any additional commentary. I'm sure the 28th of January has plenty of Orthodox Christian saints. If I would just open the Orthodox new calendar or the old calendar, there's probably a lot more important people, in our own faith to commemorate rather than an event which took place 80, 90 years ago, which, again, what relation does that have to Orthodox Christianity? I'm not too sure, okay? Again, this is all virtue
Holocaust,
signaling.
it means burnt offering. What do you, this is, I would argue this is similar to the Hindu situation that Bishop Athenagoras had to apologize for, because, the Holocaust, it means burnt offering. It's this whole religious significance now in the Jewish faith, the killers of Christ, it's an integral part now of their culture and religion. So to participate in this it's like honoring false martyrs, I would say, especially in the midst of all of this. And sure, we appreciate that. I was going to read the exact quote. Archbishop Jerome, he said, "The church will wait for these children to reach an age when they grow up and wish to be baptized, and they will be baptized." And Archbishop Elpidophoros said, "I absolutely agree with what his beatitude has said," which, again, that's positive. But of course, Elpidophoros, he can't say something good without immediately going and doing something extremely cringe as well.
Yeah, I think, look, it's just, it's a matter of fact, these people are obsessed with virtue signaling. They're obsessed with naturally looking good in the eyes of the powers of the world. If myself, Conrad, and a lot of the listeners here, be it laity, clergy, we actually know what's happening. We have a good grasp of history, a good grasp of political relations. We've lived on this earth for maybe a couple of decades at most, right? We actually understand what the powers of the world are, who you cannot criticize, and who exactly holds certain leverage in the world community today. And yes, appealing to these particular people by attending their various secular and weird paganistic feasts is, I think, not the way to go, especially if you're an archbishop of the Orthodox Church. Maybe that's just my silly layman's opinion, but yet I think I hold to it. There's a lot more great Orthodox feasts which could be probably celebrated, and a lot better places to go for pilgrimage. It's Thessaloniki. You can visit this Church of Saint Demetrius, the Great Martyr, for example. There's so many monasteries and churches around Thessaloniki who'd love to have an archbishop serve there for a weekend, be it a Saturday or something. Come on, what is going on here? It's similar to I remember the story of Metropolitan Saint Agafangel Yaroslavsky, who actually sat in gulags in the 1920s for several. He's one of the few martyrs who, he's not a martyr, he's a confessor, but he passed away without actually getting shot during the Stalinist years of persecution in the USSR. And when he went to his spiritual mother, Saint Ksenia of Rybinsk, and actually asked her, "Saint Ksenia, should I side with Metropolitan Sergio Starogorodsky and support the Soviet authorities?" And she looked at him and she said, "Look, my son, if you're a bishop, but if you agree to side of Metropolitan Sergius and start, serving the Soviet government, all the grace which you've gained through all those sentences and hard labor in the gulags and the prisons and all that confessorship on the grace you've picked up through your suffering for Christ, all of that will be for naught. You will lose it all." And this is probably a good story from Saint Agafangel Yaroslavsky's life that can maybe that could be analogous to what we see here. It's yes, you visit Mount Athos, one of the holiest places on the planet, right? You obtain all this grace, and the first thing you do is you visit an event celebrating the Shoah in the city of Saint Demetri of Thessaloniki. I don't know. I don't think anything else needs to be said about this particular event. Just incredibly unfortunate.
So I want to just quickly read the statement from the Synod of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarchate. They say, "The Holy and Sacred Synod convened under the esteemed chairmanship of His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew during its session on Wednesday, January 24th, 2024, which is to address the devout faithful of the ecumenical throne regarding the ongoing discourse on the institutionalization of same-sex marriage and adoption in Greece. We reiterate the binding decision of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church convened in Crete in June 2016. The Council unequivocally stated that the Church does not accept for its members unions of same or opposite sex couples, and any other form of union apart from marriage. It emphasized the sacred significance of the union of man and woman in Christ, describing it as a small church or an image of the church. Simultaneously, we underscore that individuals within the church who engage in alternative forms of union should be treated with pastoral responsibility and love in Christ." And I thought it was kind of ridiculous that to condemn same-sex marriage, they have to invoke Crete 2016, not the scriptures or any other council or any other piece of holy tradition. They had to vindicate the fake Council of Crete. But, that shows it for you. But many people had said, Greeks online, people said, if Greece moves forward with this legalization of sodomite marriage, then maybe the Turks do deserve to invade and move in. And, maybe a lot of these Greek, some people, these are Greeks saying this, I didn't say this, I don't believe that. But it reminds me of some recent words from Metropolitan Neophytos, who was speaking in Cyprus to a monastic group of people. And he said, he was quoting St. Paisios, and he had talked to St. Paisios about his future in monasticism and how he wanted to go to the Holy Mountain. And St. Paisios told him he can't go and stay on Athos. He has to go back to Cyprus and build monasteries. St. Paisios referred to them as like bases, like military bases in the spiritual war. You have to go build them in your homeland, and you will find that that will bring you much spiritual fruit. And St. Paisios said that the problem of Cyprus is not a political one, but a spiritual one. He said the occupation of Turkey in the north is a spiritual problem, not something that can be resolved with just politics. And St. Paisios specifically said that these bases, these monasteries, will drive out the bases of the English, the Turks, as well as the bases of sin that you Greek Cypriots are building. So, the answer to all of this stuff, whether it's this gay marriage in Greece or, Cyprus degeneracy and whatnot, which again, they're Greek Cypriots as well, it's the same nation. The answer is what these Athonite monks did to Elpidophoros. It's, the church needs to act, the church needs to stand up and say no. Like, the Greek people do not support this. Polls show 55% of Greek people just right off the bat when polled completely against this. Only like 18% of Greeks support the current legislation in its form. So there's really no reason that this should happen at all. And the church needs to stand up and, be the shepherds to the spiritual flock that they can be and need to be in a situation like this.
That's really well said, Conrad. I think it's important that like the church needs to act as the soul, the collective soul of the Orthodox nation people, especially a country like Greece, where 90% of people are either church going or at least nominally Orthodox. Even more than 90%. It's somewhere like over 95% at this point. But we just have to consider like this is the role of the church. And most countries suffer with this particular view because modern society, modern liberal culture, and the way it has infected some of our societies destroys the way church taught morality and ethics are actually implemented into everyday life. Like, sin is a lot easier to adhere to these days than maybe even decades ago. It's a lot more easily accessible. And we're talking about various degrees of sin, various types. Things are a lot looser. Even the old canons of the church aren't readily acceptable at all by today's standards because they're simply too harsh. We've fallen so much in our general morality, and of course, this falls on the spiritual leaders to actually apply some of those canonical economia decisions to everyday life and actually lead us forward through these struggles. An example of that, right? Let's just speak about the positive things which are taking place this week. Patriarch Kirill, at the opening, the Christmas readings which take place in Russia every year, a few weeks after Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January, he gave an opening speech before the Russian parliament, the Russian Duma, in which he spoke about three primary things. So this is before most of the deputies of the Russian Duma parliament, including Vyacheslav Volodin, a lot of the Russian politicians from United Russia, even members of the Communist Party were there. And Patriarch Kirill spoke about three primary things, which we posted about in our Telegram. The first thing was, naturally, his strong stance against abortion, calling abortion a directly murder, saying that it needs to be made illegal, essentially inaccessible. He spoke about private clinics not being able to operate and actually induce abortions. He said that abortion is essentially a crime, and he summarized what a lot of us have been preaching and kind of talking about for a very long time. But to all these politicians who have essentially do have the authority to make this thing illegal, yet they've held back for a few decades in Russia now at the moment. And this is something which was injected, unfortunately, into Russian culture and society by Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin and his Bolshevik compatriots in the early 20th century, and which has continued to infest Russian society as this destructive moral disease to this day, right? This issue of abortion, sacrificing of children to Moloch and Baal, maybe even indirectly, but still very, very negative. Patriarch Kirill spoke out against that. He spoke out against mass immigration, saying that, look what's happening in Europe today. The European people, this is paraphrasing Patriarch Kirill, this is the European people gave up on their Christian values. And so when they opened the doors for mass immigration through their liberal policies, the immigrants actually brought with them even more traditional values than the Europeans already held onto. And so a lot of Europeans have begun, instead of the actual Muslims and Africans assimilating into European Christian culture, it's the other way around. The actual Europeans are intermarrying and even assimilating into some of the various pagan and heathen cultures which are being brought into Europe itself because, well, Protestantism and lukewarm Catholicism simply isn't attractive, nor to the domestic residents, nor to the new foreign immigrants. Patriarch Kirill says Russia has no reason to gloat over this particular issue Europe is facing, but it needs to actually prepare itself for a potential crisis in this field as well, given all the illegal immigrants we see coming from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, things like that, which we've spoken about, and media companies like Sideguard have covered for a little while. And Patriarch Kirill himself is very focused on this mass immigration, the immigration of immigrant Muslims in particular. This issue, he's addressing it quite adequately. And of course, the third point Patriarch Kirill mentioned, this is his strongest point. He essentially called for the multipolarity. He said, Russia at the moment, fortunately or unfortunately, is leading the world in the struggle against the system which will bring around the age of the Antichrist. Patriarch Kirill called Russia this collective leader, this katakon, and he said that we're holding back evil. And the fact he said that the Antichrist is a real personified figure which will come into the world. And at the moment, Russia is leading this resistance in the world against these destructive, deviant values which will bring about. And I mean, this sounds really pathos filled, like this speech, but I think it's right. It takes somebody like Patriarch Kirill to, maybe it seems obvious to us and you guys, our listeners, but somebody like Patriarch Kirill really needs to dot the I's and cross the T's into these important bureaucrats who essentially spend all day not reading any religious literature. He actually needs to accentuate the fact that the SMO is not just a local peacekeeping operation in the Ukraine of some sort. It's actually a civilizational battle against the forces of the Antichrist and its servants, such as Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, who are being led by, well, the people, who are supporting Israel and all these other satanic projects around the world. And Patriarch Kirill made that very, very clear in his Duma speech. It's quite a great development. I think a very positive and hopeful message from our Russian hierarch.
I think that's about as good a place as any to start wrapping this up. Of course, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. You can find everything. We've got some really amazing articles coming up very soon, so be sure to subscribe there. Get on the email list. Get all of our content right into your inbox the moment it drops. World War Now on YouTube. Subscribe, like, leave a comment. Really like the videos. It helps us a lot if you smash the like button. And subscribe, of course. It helps us on YouTube to get boosted up in the algorithm. Of course, follow us on Twitter, World War Now _. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Rumble as well, World War Now. And just spread the word everywhere. Share the show, send it around, and get behind the paywall if you want to support us, of course, on the Substack, worldwarnow.co. You get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes. We had a great interview with Anthony of Westgate recently, which should be in the link below. So the link should be down in the description below, so be sure to check that out. It's a really great discussion about the tunnels and some other, esoteric stuff regarding our friends, them boys. So yeah, check us out in all those places. Links are down below, of course. Dimitri, any last words on World War III?
Yeah, I think, look, we're following the news. It seems like every week, every fortnight, there are these new unexpected developments. I didn't think this immigrant crisis in Texas would actually, we saw it coming up and we mentioned it a few months ago, but I didn't see it escalate to this so-called constitutional crisis it's in at the moment. And who knows where we'll be next week. So, of course, we ask everybody, keep going to church, guys. Keep attending liturgies. Pray at home. Keep the fast. Follow the directions of your local priests, bishops. And if you're not an Orthodox Christian, get in touch with your local priest. Naturally, just go online, Google, where is my local Orthodox parish? Get involved directly, because at this point, I'm not going to say you're in the, you're missing out, but in fact, for a large portion, I think you're missing out. There's not much time of peace left, I think, between now and the major events to come. So I think it's good to spiritually prepare now for the potential tumultuous future coming up. Right now, we actually, this post-COVID period, we do have the ability to fast, to attend church, to practice and to build the spiritual disciplines which we can build in a time of peace, relatively, especially us in the Western world at the moment. Crisis has not yet dawned upon us in full force. So let's just use that. And again, me and Conrad, we are doing a lot of things. There's some great guests coming up. Naturally, we're working on a lot of pretty cool projects. So keep us in your prayers, clergy, laity, fellow brothers and sisters, and we thank you for listening to the show. 2024 is looking like it's going off, starting off with a good blast, and we're entering into the second month of the year. So looking forward to some pretty positive developments, despite all of the somewhat negative and pretty scary news that take place sometimes.
Thanks for listening, everybody. God bless.